every economic measure that the U.S. would take, again, vis-a-vis other countries, was always punitive. That's the way that we tend to phrase things. It's just like, we must punish this country because they're not playing fair. It's never about, well, we need to protect our own industries. That's not the kind of language that's been used. And that seems to be, sometimes you hear the protection language in the Trump administration, but in general, especially these recent truth social posts from Trump, it's the same kind of punitive language, and even more bombastic in the case of Trump. But I would also say more spurious. Like it's just not that they have violated some understanding related to trade, but rather, I don't like you because you persecuted my friend Bolsonaro. That kind of thing. 50% tariffs on Brazil. That's what we're getting. In other cases, it may be just that, okay, yeah, you guys sell too much stuff to us. We don't like that. We're going to slap, 25% on South Korea, 25% on Japan. And then there are a lot of other countries, of course, that have been, for various reasons, are being subjected to these tariffs. And it's just a very erratic fashion, announced through a Trump true social post. So that's the kind of, it's really rather bizarre, and it should be, I find it, well, I can't say I've gotten used to it. We've been 6 months into this administration, but it's just really pretty wild. It's something that I don't think anybody could have foreseen, even from Trump, because looking at the first administration, it was, you got a lot of tweets, but you didn't get real actions like this. We're talking about really serious things, the fate of countries, the relationships between countries, and they could be potentially decided by a tweet made in a moment of anger,
No, it's so crazy. It's so wild. I was just thinking about that this morning. If we just take a step back and just look at the past decade in the United States, just the state of U.S. leadership. We have Trump and then we have Biden, which was just it was insane that we had someone like Biden as president for so long, that everyone's aware of his cognitive impairments. And now we get Trump, who's just insane. He's just a wild man. And it's just, and it's comically abysmal. It sometimes makes me think that maybe we are living in a simulation. Because like, how could this be possible? It's like the dev set up some sandbox for us and just turned the insanity level up to 100 to see what could happen. But what's so strange to me is that it's just the U.S. I remember as a little kid. It was just clear that U.S. #1, we're great, and there was just sort of this general consensus amongst the whole world that America was the greatest country in the world, the superpower. It's where everybody wanted to move to. Everybody thought it was produce cool movies, and American culture was being exported everywhere. And then it seemed like just in a blink of an eye, it just all evaporated. And you look at the leadership, and people are looking at the United States, and it's like, is this what the best in the world produces? Like, how does that happen? How does a country that has such a great reputation, okay, let's say prior 2001, even really just to take it 10 years ago, pre-Trump, Obama, it's like, how does it fall so quickly? It's just proof that how does our supposedly greatest system in the world, we had the end of history, all that, and then it produces this. It produces Biden and Trump.
Right. Well, I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know that I do. I mean, it is hard to explain. That you can say one thing, that there were trends in place that they were in place before, let's say, the Trump's first election. First of all, there's a relative decline between the U.S. and the rest of the world. When you look at by the end of the 1990s, or maybe especially the mid 1990s, there was just this huge gap. The U.S. was the sole superpower, so we called it a hyperpower. And but in that time, Russia was just really on the ropes back in the 1990s. But beginning with Putin's election in 1999, and then it began to recover, and it's recovered remarkably. And then, of course, China was just really beginning its recovery from the Cultural Revolution. It was still a very, very poor country in in the early 90s. But now it's, there are pockets of poverty, of course, but overall it's a very, very prosperous country and has surpassed us in manufacturing. And that you can just say that it's true of much of the rest of the world too. These are just two, I think, the most obvious examples. So, there was a time when you could say, the U.S. is just by far ahead of the rest of the countries, according to many different measures. And that's just not true anymore. But that was a trend. I think that was inevitable. There's just no way that was a set of unique historical circumstances that put the U.S. in that position. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. But that changed. So part of it was just inevitable. We weren't going to be the hyperpower for forever. But then just the kind of people that are rising to the top and the kind of the obsessions of this new elite, I find that hard to understand. I don't know if there's really a rational explanation for that. Maybe you can just say it's just sort of a late empire kind of disease that, like you look at the fall of the Roman Empire and the kind of people that rose to the top. I'm sure all of us, even who have any sort of acquaintance with Roman history, know some of the names of the madness that began to kind of grip the central power there. And again, it's hard to explain. I guess part of it is maybe it's an outgrowth of that sense of being a hyperpower. It just kind of it atrophies the mind. People lose a grip on reality. They get a sense, we're talking about the elite in particular, that their power is unlimited, and they stop making these hard-headed calculations about what's necessary to maintain their power. It was, who was it, Karl Rove in the Bush administration that said we create our own reality. And in a sense, it was almost true back then. You could do whatever, virtually, the U.S. could do virtually whatever it wanted. Maybe not successfully, but it just go bomb a country without any consequences for itself. And if it was a failure, well, which it often was, to be honest, but you had the power of the media to just kind of spin it whatever way you wanted. So you just go on to the next, or to memory hole it, and maybe that's another thing that's changed too, is that we just don't have that power of the media. It's not the same extent even within this country. Of course, it's been eaten away. People become skeptical. There are alternative sources of information, but that explains the diminution of American power, but it doesn't explain the kind of people that we have at the top, and the kind of the madness that has really gripped the country. And you just don't see any alternatives. Like, okay, I know there are Democrats who think, well, if we get our guy back in charge, but come on, you remember Biden, and Kamala Harris really wasn't any better. And then the Republicans, who are still championing Trump, but with, I think, less and less enthusiasm. The fact is, it's a bipartisan phenomenon. And it's just a reality, again, just, compare the quality of people that we have to the quality of people that govern China and Russia, for example. And there's just no comparison. They're just the Chinese and the Russians. Maybe you hate them, but you have to say that these people are much more intelligent, and they have a much firmer grip on reality than virtually any Western leader. It's not just the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I still don't understand. I mean, I guess there is no explanation, but I remember the George W. Bush days, and everybody was making fun of him as some kind of buffoon. But he looks like Socrates now compared to what we have now. It's unbelievable to me that the decline can be so rapid. It makes me wonder, do you think it's in large part intentional? I mean, like with Biden, everybody knew that Bernie Sanders was the most popular person amongst the Democratic voters. And then Biden was the one put in. And maybe it's because they're like, okay, his mind's going great. We can manipulate him more easily. We can just push through whatever we want. And then, okay, people didn't want Trump because he sounded like he was going to be a fly in the ointment of the system and drain the swamp. But I think the deep state just realizes that actually Trump is very easy to manipulate. You just have to flatter him. You just tell him how great he is, how awesome he is, and then, okay, sure, yeah, start sending money here. Sure, I'll bomb that country for you. All right, Lindsey Graham, we'll do these tariffs or crushing sanctions or whatever. It's just, I don't know. Is it potentially intentional that there's this evil?
Well,
like, how do you produce? It just doesn't make sense. Like, we get so worked up over these elections, and you just look at the quality of our candidates. It's like, how are we getting so worked up over just, Dumb and Dumber here? It's just, I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that it's intentional in the sense that, that like the Democrats really wanted somebody suffering from dementia. For various reasons, they didn't want a Bernie Sanders who seemed like he was a kind of, a revolutionary, or he was going to make changes.
More his position on Israel than anything. I mean, he's kind of wishy-washy sometimes with Israel, but
right. And on a lot of things, it's turned out, that he's been kind of a disappointment for people who thought that he was going to be a real alternative. But even so, he does actually stray from the mainstream narrative, and he does stand outside of the establishment, at least, on occasion. So they had their worries about him. They didn't want him, and they ended up rallying around Biden. Now, I don't know that they fully understood. They probably knew that there were cognitive problems, but it was limited and they could handle it. I think they miscalculated. They didn't understand how serious the problem was. And then they were stuck with them and they just had to hide it. Now, in Trump's case, he wasn't the first choice of the Republican establishment, clearly. And so it was a real shock to the system, including the Republican establishment, when he was first elected. But he was really neutered in that first term of his. And I think that the Republican establishment in particular came to accept him, figured that they could work with him. And so he began to, they brought him in and made him part of the establishment. And when he was elected again, well, we had some surprises. People that were clearly outside of the establishment were nominated. I think we all know the names, or more than that, appointed. But clearly, I think the calculations that the Republican establishment made were correct. We can control this guy. And, maybe we would rather have somebody else, but we can control him. So we'll just have to live with him and work with him.
Right. So we using these terms, establishment, that basically are deciding our political leaders here in the United States. But are we able to kind of define that a bit more? It's like as the establishment, is it like 40% Zionist, 20%, neocon or anti-China? Like what is that? Is the establishment making? What is their worldview? Because that's clearly, they will only allow people to get into power that follow their view of the world, follow their ideology. Can you define that?
When you're talking about Zionism, it's close to 100%. It's just a question of intensity, and for both.
For the establishment.
Yeah, both parties too.
So it's a Zionist establishment.
When you get to foreign policy, there's really, it's a bipartisan establishment. And it's, when it comes to Zionism, it's a question of like how passionately attached are you to it, or and what kind of rhetoric do you use. But in the end, it's pretty much unconditional support for Israel all across the board. I don't think there's really any exceptions.
So is it a hyperbole then to say that our country is owned by essentially Israel, if it's Zionist, and that means you're putting the interests of another country ahead of your own, right? That's what Zionism is. Well,
right. I mean, the thing is, it's not just, in some cases you could say it's really, Israel is kind of like a puppet master, and through AIPAC and so on, is directly controlling members of Congress. I think that's clear. We just know that's true, but it's not entirely. It'd be unfair to look at it entirely in those terms, because there is, especially like coming out of Christian Zionism, there are a lot of people that, even absent those pressures coming from Israel, have this commitment to Israel. And so it is, it's not just that it's like Israel's running the show, and if you cut the strings, everything would be fine. It would still go on. If if Israel lost its influence, like he shut down AIPAC and so forth, there still would be something there.
Not
Quite a bit.
that
Yeah,
much,
not as
probably,
much.
right?
No. So, I'm saying like that statement, like the Israel runs, that's, an overstatement, but it's not, but there is a lot of truth to it. I think that you just have to admit it. And that's, again, people like great scholars like John Mearsheimer really have shown that very persuasively.
Yeah, it's so obvious now to everybody, especially just I don't know if it's just my Twitter feed, probably my X feed, but it just seems like in general everybody's wake. It's the fault of the Zionists themselves because they're calling everybody an anti-Semite now. They're I think they're panicking, to be honest. And we see these actions like do you know that UN human rights I
Yeah,
don't know if
Francesca
Francesca,
Right,
right,
right.
like they're gloating, all these Zionists gloating online, like, yeah, that's what you get if you try to go against Israel. We'll get the U.S. to sanction you. It's like, what? It's like
Yeah,
the United States is
yeah,
not, we didn't sanction her for saying anything about America or the United States. She's
right,
speaking out against what Israel's doing in Gaza, which everybody is aware of. And like, this
right,
is a problem. No matter I don't care if you want to call it a genocide or not. I think any decent human being can look at what's happening in Gaza and say that this is not an acceptable behavior for any country to engage in. This
right,
is not okay. This is
right,
not, especially if you say, oh, we're some Western civilized society. This is not a way any civilized society can perform. And I think everybody's realizing that, and it's just destroying the whole United States. But when we see these types of, the open gloating of canceling people and trying to ruin people's careers because they are saying like we don't like what Israel's doing in Gaza, I think that's a bad move for the Zionists, right? Everybody's seeing that. Like, why are you doing this? And we can see them just pulling the levers on the United States. Like, okay,
yeah.
great, we canceled this person, and that. What does it mean when you sanction a person? We talk about sanctioning a country. Is she
Yeah.
ruined? Like, is it a big deal if the U.S. sanctions
Yeah.
a person?
Well, I think, like in her case, she probably can't come to. I know I've read some things about it, but I can't recall the actual sanctions that were imposed on. Often it is that, well, the person is actually not free to travel to the U.S. and is maybe even at risk in some cases of being arrested in certain countries that are very close to the U.S. I don't think that's true of her. They did the same thing to Khan, who was the head of the ICC, the prosecutor there, after he, brought charges against Netanyahu. Um, but I think they even farther, like they were going after his bank account. I don't know if they were successful with that, but it's quite extraordinary. They again, because of the U.S.'s dominance over so many parts of the world and so many international institutions, it can do a lot of harm to an individual if it really goes after them. So, yeah, that's what we're looking at. I mean, um, but going just back to your point about how open they are, I think that's a real change, and it is a sign actually of their declining power. It used to be that they could operate within the shadows, and that again, if you pointed to Israel, or if you pointed to Jewish Zionists, or um, you were instantly an anti-Semite. This is crazy talk, but it's just like as you're saying, it's coming out in the open, and they are being less and less subtle about how they exercise their power, and that's a sign that they are in trouble. And I think it's actually by operating openly and with in a more kind of brutal, I think maybe that, or blunt fashion, um, they're doing harm to themselves, and they're only going to actually accelerate that process that we see taking place. So it is they do have these organizations like APAC and ADL. They do have a reason for being nervous, again, and they are aware of the polls that they're losing even their, like Jewish young people are leaving them in droves, and they're aware of that. That's, but I don't think they have an answer to it, because it is the genocide, and they are not willing to halt that genocide. And so, this is going to continue to eat away at their support. So the answer is, well, okay, we don't change our behavior, but we just go after our opponents with even, greater viciousness. But you do that, and of course you exacerbate the problem. That's what we're looking at.
Right. Do you think there's any awareness that is, I mean, clearly not. I don't know if it's just, how front and center do you think the Israeli issue is becoming to the average everyday citizen? I think a lot of people maybe didn't want to address it because maybe they're like, a little uncomfortable. I'm not following that closely. Let's just don't talk about it. But the more, like you're saying, that they're trying to combat it and just they're pushing Israel and anti-Semitism front and center. I mean, I just see it constantly in my Twitter. It might be my algorithm. I understand,
right.
but I just feel like it's been increasing even more. That it's got to get to the point where now you're forcing everyday people to look at this issue. And if you're Israel, you don't want people to look at this issue because it doesn't look good. But maybe in their mind, they just fully think that, any rational person will think that we're the victim because we believe that so strongly. And
well, that's what's repeated again and again. That's, I think it was, what was it, the head of Google, one of these megacorp recently made just virtually that same statement. He said the UN was a transparently anti-Semitic organization, and the Israelis were the victims. Can't you understand that? But anyway,
don't cancel us, YouTube. That's what I'm worried about.
Right. Well, there is a danger. Okay. Yeah. Let's say. Yeah, you can say a danger of or a tendency, I think, sometimes to overestimate changes because we operate within certain communities, and that's something like you're saying, you see these things online because you're part of that community and the algorithms feed these things to you, and so that can give you a sense that there is this that the vast majority of people on your side, and that's not true, but the polls are showing a real shift, where we have now a majority of the population having a negative view of Israel. That's a huge change, it's a big change from a decade ago, and it's a huge change from a generation ago, where, this is something that's continuing and is probably going to accelerate. So it is getting through to the average person. Maybe they don't have a full understanding. I'm sure they don't. And they don't have their opinion is maybe not so passionately held. I'm sure that's true. But it is affecting their thinking, and that's going to have huge consequences down the road.
I know you're probably not going to like this question, but can you explain these consequences? This is where I always get lost. Is what does this end up doing at some point? Because it's like, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but just it's like if you're just a guy and you've been kind of feeling a little queasy sick, and then you go to the doctor and you realize there's a parasite in you. Well, now you realize there's a parasite and you're going to get it removed and taken out. I feel like the United States, people are realizing that there is something that has infected the United States and we want to remove it. And we're seeing what it is now. And it is this Zionist control. So can we get it out? I mean, I don't know if that was a good analogy, but you understand.
Maybe you want to be careful about that analogy.
I
don't want to take that too far.
Right.
Well, it's, we already have a majority that has a negative view, but our policy hasn't changed at all. And that's something, well, it's the money and the, let's say, passion. This is an issue where there is clearly passion on both sides. Because the Zionists many of them are passionately Zionist, and that's one reason they make that. This is, some of these mega donors. I think it was Saban, who was like the leading donor to the Democratic Party for a long time. He may still be, I haven't looked at it recently, but he said that he had, basically one issue, and that was Israel. And so you have people like this. So they, when you combine that with the money and organization, that makes for a very powerful group that can really dominate politics. And plus, they've done the groundwork. They've groomed people. They have loyal members of Congress. They have loyal members like who was the current I guess CIA director. If you go way back, he had been really identified as an Israel supporter, like when he first entered politics and they established a relationship with him now, provided money, helped his career, and then here he is, in a real position of power in the administration. Um, so you have that. They've done the groundwork, and it's something that goes back decades. So they've got this power, and it's just not going to disappear over time. Now, you have this shift. You do have, it has to be admitted, this passionate um, opposition to Israel and in particular, what it's doing to the Palestinians. And that is growing. So there is real passion on that side, but you don't have the power. You don't have the money. You don't have the organization. But these people will enter politics. And this will have, again, we're talking about a real shift among, across the political spectrum, particularly on the left, but on the right too. And very importantly, among, young Jewish people. So this is going to have huge consequences, but they're up against this establishment, and these kind of establishments don't fall overnight. Now the establishment is showing, it's fighting back. I don't think it's doing it very effectively, but it's fighting back, and it will continue to fight. And it may use increasingly undemocratic means, authoritarian means to maintain its power. They're not going to go down without a fight. And we can see it in places like the UK. Where recently there was a group called Palestinian Action, I think it is, and they splashed some red paint on some planes at a air base in the UK, and then were declared a terrorist group. And then, according to UK law, you express support for this group, and then charges could be brought against you. That's what's happening. Now, meanwhile, support for the genocide is not a problem. Nobody gets in trouble with it. But people are seeing, the blatant injustice and double standard here, and it is, it is increasing the rate. So we're getting this. There's a potential. I've said this, I think, with regard to other issues, but certainly, with regard to Israel, just an increasingly authoritarian and establishment against that is at odds with its own population, and that. We'll see where that leads us. I think in the end, you can't keep that up, but they might keep it up for a long time. They may just end up actually shutting down various avenues of democratic protest just to maintain control. That's what we're seeing already.